Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That is, of course, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Ininuak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are so pleased to have so many of you here, both live and in person, of course, for the launch of John Longhurst's collection of columns, Can Robots Love God and Be Saved? A Journalist Reports on Faith. Please excuse me as I sometimes awkwardly address this camera in front of me. We are so happy to have John and an all-star panel here for you tonight, so I will not take up too much of your time. The one thing I did want to acknowledge right out of the gate is that this is a publication of CMU Press. We're always so incredibly pleased to work with this small but mighty press located at the Canadian Mennonite University, which is, of course, essentially the brainchild and passion project of the one and only Sue Sorensen, who is standing in the back. We're so thrilled to have these in print. John was hosting an event just here in our space last week, so it's particularly delightful to be able to turn the proverbial camera on him and really celebrate his many years of writing for the Winnipeg Free Press and all the insight contained within his columns. Everybody else on stage is much more interesting than myself, though, so I will not take up much more of your time. The only things I will point out are procedural at this point. The first is that if time permits, there may be time for questions from the audience at the close of this event. Now, if you're one of those gathered here, we will just ask that you put up your hand, and our host this evening will repeat the question for the benefit of those watching at home. And if you do happen to be one of those watching at home and have a question for the panel, please feel free to write it in the chat, and I will try to, not particularly clumsily, gracefully slide my cell phone in front of our host to show him the question itself. Following the event, the only thing I will put in your mind is that we'll ask you to remain in place for one moment while we safely transport John to the signing table. That's just beside the cash desk, and I'll have more adrenaline-packed notes on how you can get a book signed at the close of the event, so please do look forward to that. But for now, it's my great pleasure to return this handheld microphone to your wonderful host for the evening. That is, of course, the Reverend Dr. Michael Wilson of Charleswood United Church. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone. What a delight to have such a great turnout, and what an honor to be part of this event. As John said, I'm the minister at Charleswood United Church. I have been on the Free Press Faith Page Advisory Board since that came into creation with the Faith in the News project, but we'll get to that later on in the evening. It did occur to me to say that earlier today, my mind brought me to my first encounter with John. And I want to tell you about it because I suspect that I first encountered John the way many of you first encountered John. I wrote a letter to the Free Press complaining about one of his columns. In a beautifully articulated counter-argument, I might say. And rather than getting an angry letter back from John, he replied by saying, "That was interesting. Why don't we put it in the paper?" And then we've been friends ever since. Yeah. Let me introduce the panelists today. Of course, John Longhurst, Free Press columnist and the author of "Can Robots Love God and Be Saved?" Beside John is Paul Samyn, editor of the Free Press, whose writings we enjoy as well. On the far side of the panel, Christine Baronins, who is the Public Affairs Director for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Manitoba, and is an executive member of the Manitoba Multifaith Council and a fellow member of the Free Press Faith Advisory Board. So welcome all of you. I guess we'll go to the beginning. And Paul offered me access to the archives of the Free Press so I could look up the very first column John ever submitted. It wasn't included in the book, so I had to go deep and get the dust off of it. And I'm not saying he's done it a long time, but this is the first line from the first column John ever wrote. The Second Vatican Council, wow, which ended last week. Oh, come on.
He's not that old.
The book will tell you 900 columns over the course of 20 years. And I guess it's only fair to put the first question to John and say, why has presenting faith in the media, in the Free Press, been important to you personally? And if you want to lead that into how has that changed over the course of the last 2 decades?
It's important to me, and I suspect it's important to everyone in the room as well, because faith informs so much of society in Canada: politics, economics, culture, charitable giving. You can't tell the story of charitable giving in Canada without telling the story of religious people. And similarly, you can't tell the story of how social needs in this country are being addressed without telling the story of places of worship. So it's woven into society, even though it is declining greatly in terms of its influence and attendance and affiliation. But religion, religiosity, spirituality is still something that is really, really important to lots of Canadians, but that they don't see very often reflected in the media. In terms of changes, when I got started in this particular area back in the 90s, when I was paying more attention to faith in the media, every daily newspaper in this country had a faith page, and most of them had a faith beat, a reporter who was assigned full or part-time to covering religion. Well, today the Free Press is the only newspaper in Canada that has a faith page and a faith beat, and I am, since Mary Hines retired and the CBC closed the Tapestry program, I'm the only person who's dedicated to covering faith at a major daily newspaper or media outlet. So that's the biggest change I've seen in the 20 plus years.
So I guess that leads to the question I might ask Paul is, why does this continue to be important to the Free Press? How do you see it as part of your overall mission to the community that you serve, when we are aware that that's something in many places they've chosen to set aside?
Yeah, good question. And I think, to echo what John said, faith remains for good, bad, and otherwise an important force in society. So the question would be is, why would a newspaper not want to write about it? I know they say at dinner tables, don't talk about faith and politics. At the Free Press dinner table, we talked a lot about politics, and we thought we need to make sure that there is a regular serving and a broad nutritional diet of faith coverage. And I think it's a sign of strength that we have found a way, and we'll talk about that way a little later, I think, to ensure that we're able to deliver what others can, because it does matter. And at our core, what the Free Press is trying to do is serve this community and recognize that serving this community is serving it in the broadest possible way. And within that faith envelope, if you will, making sure that the faith coverage is broad. We know how important diversity is. We talk a lot about inclusion, and the faith initiative, as John has practiced on our pages now for years, has made sure that we have touched on literally every single faith group. And I would hope and I would pray that that coverage has led to greater understanding within our community, and the frictions and the challenges that we are seeing, and the challenges we've seen since October 7th are perhaps somewhat lessened because there's a greater awareness and understanding because of that faith coverage. Warned today that preachers should keep things to 8 minutes or less. So I'm like, because otherwise they fall asleep. So I'm watching here. No one's falling asleep yet. So we're going to carry on.
That's outrageous. At my church has to be less than an hour, but that doesn't mean the sermon can only be 8 minutes. I mean, come on. Christine, we're not going to make you speak for every faith community in the city of Winnipeg, but we're delighted that you represent the Manitoba Multifaith Council. Maybe you could say a short thing about what that is for those who aren't familiar with that title, but also why is this faith in the media, John's work, why is that important to faith communities from your perspective, from our perspective?
Well, as a public affairs communication director for my faith community, my goal, our vision is to develop relationships with individuals and to build bridges. And in the Manitoba Multifaith, in that role, we also do the same. We try to encourage interreligious understanding and interfaith dialogue. And so that those two priorities, John supports those. I feel that faith in the media, what it does is it dispels stereotypes and it counters the negative. The mass media has a lot of negative press about religion, and what the faith reporting does is it counters that. 1/3 of Canadians, they say today, do not affiliate with any religion at all, and so are often referred to as the nuns. And so we have a more secular society, and there's, even more reason why we should have faith and allow faith to have a voice in the public square. I used to work for the YMCA, and for those of you that know the Y's motto, there's a triangle, and it is mind, body, and spirit. And you really can't have one of those missing. And so the faith community tends to lead out with humanitarian aid, with volunteerism, and therefore there's social justice kinds of issues that are important for all people, regardless of faith or no faith, that I think can be addressed, that John has addressed in the public square. So I think that, I've, as a teacher, as a former teacher, it was very important to me to deviate in a way outside the curriculum and recognize, whether it be directly faith, but it's the importance of social justice issues, and having young children at an early age start to really think and to reflect on these kinds of issues. And John has encouraged that as well. So I appreciate that. And I just think that increased collaboration through faiths, increased dialogue, and a greater interreligious understanding is what John has achieved in this.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question that anyone can come in on. And if fewer and fewer outlets are covering faith, if we've seen a diminishing of that type of faith in the media, at least over these last 20 years, then I think it's fair to ask the question, what makes covering faith difficult? Where is the resistance? There's clearly no public outcry. Get that faith page back on the Toronto Star. So when we go into covering it, what makes it difficult, awkward? Where's the resistance to providing this in what is a public and commercial form?
Sure, I'll go first. One of the first difficulties I face as the religion reporter is that I don't get enough information, tips, and story ideas from faith communities. They don't do a very good job of telling their stories. As one religion reporter said to me many years ago, I'm not divine, I don't know what you're doing, you're going to have to tell me. And a few denominations and some dioceses have communication staff, but most don't. And they don't think to tell me that they've got something really interesting or exciting happening in their communities, or that there's a person who's done something amazing and you should know about it. Of course, we can't promise to publish everything, but if I don't know, I can't do it. That's the first thing. Secondly, Canada's become so much more religiously diverse. I was on the phone this week, with some Muslims who are celebrating Eid, a second Eid on Sunday to celebrate the Hajj. And I had no idea about at first I didn't know there was a second Eid, and I was embarrassed by that. Secondly, I just didn't know all that went into it. There's so much you have to learn about all these different religions. Coming at it as a Christian, I always tell people, hey, if this is a dumb question, I'm sorry, but I just don't know how you worship. And so it gets hard to tell those stories. The third thing that makes it hard, again, telling the stories of minority religions, is that there are a lot of newcomers here from countries where saying anything in public that might be critical of anyone can get you in jail or worse. And they are reluctant sometimes to talk to reporters. And it takes time to build relationships, to go to dinners, to show up at the mosque, at the temple, at the Gurdwara, just to say hello and you can trust me, really, this is fine. And that's another obstacle just to doing this kind of work.
Anyone else?
I think the difficulty a little bit though is just the realities of the media landscape that we currently have. Newspapers everywhere are shrinking. Any number of newsrooms have shuttered. It takes revenue to produce journalism. Okay, it says free press. Remember, it's not free. It's a good deal, but it ain't free. So as sort of the pressure has come down on newsrooms everywhere, they have made decisions. And newsrooms today are smaller than they were used to be. So things that you could have seen, things that you enjoyed, they're no longer there. And unfortunately, I think faith-based reporting has been one of those casualties. We didn't want that to happen for us. And so we wanted to look at alternative revenue streams. And Bob Cox is here as a former publisher. Bob, in conjunction with John, met with any number of faith groups in the city and said, you know what, we can do more, but we're gonna need some help. And it was the equivalent of passing the collection plate that got this going, gave us enough additional resources so we could build on the Saturday Faith page and ensure that we had faith coverage in the news pages, sports pages, business, arts and life, because we didn't want to ghettoize. Part of what we're trying to do is ensure that the broad community, Winnipeggers, Manitobans, are aware of things that are going on. And there's a big difference about a front page story as opposed to something that gets tucked away on the faith page. And I think that's been the success of the program. 6 years in, the community has rallied, they have seen value in it. And I think it's, again, something that a newspaper has to do. It's not just politics, it's not just jets. It's what happening when people worship and what they're able to bring to the community and the challenges that their various congregations are dealing with.
And as Michael said, I can't speak on behalf of all faith communities, but I can sort of just maybe touch on what John was talking about, the difficulty of reaching out to faith communities. I think that faith communities, because of past persecutions and difficulties, they're pretty insular and they don't want to be reaching out. I think that's one of the reasons. I think another reason is there's sort of a general sense of like a humility. They're doing good things, but they don't necessarily want to toot their own horn. So that's probably another aspect. I think that it's the sacred. So when you're wanting to interview people about things that are very sacred to them, they're not really comfortable with that. So those are just some things that I had thought of how it's difficult to interview and to cover stories of faith. I think that's some of it. They tend to be protectionist.
Thank you. This comes from perhaps a bias of my own, but certainly something that I was reflecting on. And that is that those of us who would participate in something like the Manitoba Multifaith Council events, or interfaith dialogue, or the Faith in the News Project or the Free Press Advisory, come with a certain theological bent, and that is that we're open to that we want to be in community with people with whom we have some differences, certainly different understandings, different theologies, but nevertheless, we don't want to just offer respect or tolerance. We genuinely have a certain like-mindedness, that there's value in that. And I guess, not being a media person, I was kind of interested in the idea, if that's true, and you can comment whether you think that's true or not, does that result in a certain bias in the coverage? Is there a liberal or progressive leaning in what the Free Press and other media would put out there?
Balanceful.
Okay. I'm gonna talk about liberalism in the sense that the ability for a bunch of ideas to be present and to be discussed. And I don't think we have enough of that anymore. And I think that from those who religion is very important to them, frequently feel that their voices, their concerns, their ideas aren't welcome in the broader discussion. Okay. If we're doing our job, and I again hope and pray that we are, we're ensuring that voices that matter, voices that need to be heard, voices that can contribute, and voices that shouldn't just be shouted down because they're different. Here's the irony. We are moving into a society that has greater recognition of diversity. I think this room would recognize the value of that. So if we're going to move down that road, how can we say diversity, yes, but not the kind of stuff that happens in the church pews? Okay, and that may be, to your point, Michael, one of the reasons that other media have made decisions to not go into this space. We have gone into this space. I think John is able, because of the connections and the relationships he's built with leaders among all the faith communities. He goes in there with an open mind. He asks the questions. He has the background. And he has the respect so that we can come back with stories that ensure that stuff that we perhaps should be aware of or thinking, we can disagree with. But I want that to be part and parcel of what you can find in the Free Press.
Here, here.
Let me ask the reporter's question, though, keeping along the same lines, though. Is it more difficult to find stories or to write on people that don't share that like-mindedness, that respect for religious diversity? And do you go looking for that? Do you look?
What I'm always looking for is something that I call balance. There are going to be stories from left and right, conservative, liberal, the markers that people put in those things. But I want to make sure that everybody's viewpoint is somehow represented in the writing and reporting I do. But to echo Paul, unfortunately, we're in a time now when it's very difficult to do that, where people with deeply held beliefs on one thing or another think that their point of view is the only point of view. And if you share someone else's point of view, then you get the angry emails that question your sanity, your humanity, your integrity, and sometimes your faith. Paul has received a number of those as well. It's just the times. It's really hard to write about certain subjects because some people will immediately write you off when all you want to do is say, hey, had you also thought that this point of view, this person's point of view might be valid too, or his or her pain might be just as much as your pain? And that's the tough situation we're in right now.
Thank you for that.
I agree, and I think we are experiencing that in the interfaith community. You are walking on eggshells right now. So that's the hope, and what John's trying to achieve right now. We hope we'll push that along and move us to a place where it will be okay to have differences. It will be okay to discuss our differences and to come to some kind of common ground. That is the goal that we always are working towards.
Yeah. Well, I think the work that you do and your colleagues who also report on religion in the Free Press are helping that both and attitude be out there and helping us develop and retain that capacity to let different things be held and thought of in the same way, respected. And
Michael, just there was a period, for a long period of time on the Free Press, our editorial page said freedom of trade, freedom of religion. I can't remember the third one. We changed that in 2014-ish, where we essentially did a treaty land acknowledgement to say that we are been published since 1872 on Treaty 1 territory and homeland of Métis. But that line was freedom of religion, not freedom from religion.
Right.
Now, it doesn't say that anymore, but I think what's more important is that you see that through John's writing and through the other contributors who have been part and parcel of this project and will continue to be so.
If you stop and think about it, or buy and read John's book, and you're looking back at some of the issues in the last 20 years that are about religion or religion adjacent, and I'm thinking about issues that are covered in the Free Press and in all media, certainly not just by those who cover faith. They're extensive and they are fascinating and they are profoundly interesting. Think about, and actually, you can't go past chapter 2 without realizing the impact that the TRC, the calls to action, the responses and the no responses to the calls of action, and most significantly, the calls for a papal apology have had an effect on John, because those columns are in here. They're very powerful and meaningful. But in addition to those, thinking back 20 years now and where we were then on MAID, on Pride, on Black Lives Matter, on the impact of immigration and refugee sponsorship in the religious landscape, not to mention one of John's favorite topics, which is the decline of religiosity and the growth of nuns, as Christine mentioned. Although anytime somebody says 1/3 of people don't believe anymore, I go, yeah, but 2/3 do. So that's got to be hopeful. All of these issues, and it's interesting to see, because you can see the thoughts that John had 20 years ago and 15 years ago and 10 years ago and 5 years ago. All of them find an airing in John's columns, not just the ones collected in the books. Among all of these, John, this is primarily for you. What has had the most impact on you personally and as a journalist? Would you, I don't want you to rank or rate them, but maybe a few stories about some of these very significant issues.
Sure, and one of the most important and the ones that were most moving to me is reconciliation with Indigenous people. I had the opportunity and the privilege of going to Rome last 2 years ago. Free Press helped make that possible, to report about those initial discussions with Indigenous people about a papal apology, and then to cover the Pope when he came to Alberta to issue that apology. And the Archdiocese of St. Boniface invited me to join the bus going to Alberta to cover that event. And that bus was filled with residential school survivors. And at first, there was a lot of wariness, a reporter on the bus, but I just took time, I just listened. And by the end of the bus ride, they were lining up to talk to me because they wanted someone to hear their story. And the stories that were told, that how do you receive a story from a child who said, I was taken away from my home when I was 6 years old and put in a residential school, and I could see my house across the street, but I couldn't go there and see my parents. And that's where she spent her school days. Like how do you respond to those kinds of things? Well, what you do is you honor them by telling their story. And that's what I was able to do through those 2 trips, through the pages of the Free Press. And those aren't the only people who have experienced pain. I've also had a chance to talk to people from the LGBTQ+ community who have stories of pain, of their experience in organized religion one way or another. And just to be able to say, yes, I want to hear your story and I want to share that with others, because obviously it means a lot to you. And we should hear that, and we should be prepared to absorb it and deal with it and find a way to make things better. So those are 2 really vital stories or themes that have come to mind for me. But others might have some things that they know also are really important for the Free Press and others to be talking about.
The papal visit and the stories of the survivors were the most powerful in the book for me. Those were the most powerful stories. And they really, they hit home, and because it was, I feel that's more local. with Manitoba and our Indigenous population, and I think some of those were Manitobans that you were
Yes.
quoting. So yeah, yes, those were the most powerful stories for me.
Paul, not to put you on the spot, but on many of these issues, they are being covered by writers other than your faith writers. How do you balance? Is there approach? Do you talk about that to kind of leave it up to the reporters covering whatever beat they cover to have their own approach, or do you try and work these things together?
It depends, right? So John referenced the papal visit and his time in the Vatican. There was an opportunity that only came to us because of John. Okay, that's not to say that we weren't covering stories related to that. Something comes up at the Manitoba legislature, our crew is going to manage it there. We don't summon John down to say they're talking about the papal apology, or there's going to be some recognition of something on the grounds of the legislature. He may be there, but I think what we're trying to use John is in a very specific role. It's not normally that there's breaking religious news. There can be, and if there was,
Last time
we'll do it. But for example, I think what's been in the news was on our front page first. It was Holy Trinity and the challenges facing that church and its very foundation. So, we had the reporter on that shift, I believe the story kind of broke on the weekend. They covered it. John comes back a little bit later and adds to the discussion with other layers of understanding. So I think John can break news. John can go places where others might not be able to go, and then adds layers of understanding that, again, elevates what we're able to deliver to our audience.
All right. We do want to have some of this time spent on your questions, and they can be addressed to John or to all of the panelists. I should probably do a little bit of clarifying in case someone not knowing about John, not knowing about Faith in the Free Press, but reading the title of the book, Can Robots Love God and Be Saved, might be here looking for an answer to that question. And I intend to put that question to John before the end of the night. But of course, it will require him to answer a few other questions, like, do robots stand in need of salvation? And is salvation something that someone who's not aware of their mortality can really address? And what does it mean to tell a robot that they have mortality? That seems like a rather cruel and unethical thing to do. So we're looking forward to the answers to these questions. But before we get to them, does anybody have a question? I'm going to repeat it for the sake of the online viewers. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, John. You've been writing for 20 years, lots of stories, and over that time, probably your understanding is different, your perspective is different. Are there any stories that you've run that you wish you could pull back and rewrite?
After 20 years, are there any stories he wishes he could pull back?
Rewrite.
And rewrite, or withdraw altogether?
There isn't a single reporter around who wouldn't think that. Because you read your early stuff and you think, wow, somebody published that? How could they do that? For me, it's my growth about Indigenous reconciliation. It just really wasn't on my mental or spiritual map enough when I started. I just didn't devote enough space or time to it. I didn't realize or recognize how important it was. Maybe none of us did. Maybe that just really wasn't on anyone's radar. Maybe it took the papal apology and the papal visits and all those things to really hammer it home. TRC certainly did as well. But I would say that, yes, if I could go back 15, 20 years, I would write more about that. I would say this is important and this is something we should all be paying attention to. More than we are right now as faith communities. In that respect, one thing that I have found fascinating is hanging out with Muslims and Indigenous people. So a lot of Muslims come from countries that were also colonized by Great Britain. And when Indigenous people and Muslims get together, they have a common history. They have stories that are common of having been oppressed and subjugated and dominated and made second-class citizens by their colonizer. And when you listen to those conversations, you realize, wow, East meets West and the world gets really small as these people share their common stories.
Others, yeah, please, if you could stand up so I can hear and then I'll repeat it.
Well, I have a question. I believe it was like 50s and 60s, faith with a lot of people. So it's less than quite a bit.
Right.
Is it on the upswing?
Let's repeat the question.
Yeah, the question was that if you go back 50s and 60s, faith was dominant in the culture. Is that a fair way to say it? It was covered in all media. Stronger than now, covered in all media, yeah. So this might relate to many of the articles you say about the struggling of faith communities. There's also a lot of stories about the revitalization of faith communities in a number of different ways. But do you have anything further to respond to that?
We started off by saying that 1/3 of Canadians don't really identify as being religious. But I think to John's point earlier, what we have seen are a variety of new faiths come to the fore as our nation has changed. Now, it is unfortunate that newspapers aren't covering that the same way they were in the 50s and 60s. I think it's also unfortunate that newspapers and indeed our newsroom were not attuned to those different faith communities, though the experiences of new Canadians who were bringing in new ideas of faith. So I don't know if the diminishment of faith coverage leads to less faith within Canada, if that was your question. I don't think there's necessarily a linkage, but at some level, I think media coverage influences everything that we do. It shapes our culture, and so maybe there is some linkage. Jim, you have another related?
Yes, sorry, I totally agree. But, okay, so I know it's wrong. There's a lot of digital stations on TV that are dedicated to faith. But then again, newspapers, I think, okay, for myself, I love getting press. I get press this on. It's just, okay, they don't have any faith in each one. But still, I think it's important.
And I would agree with you. And in the 40s and 50s and 60s, many more people went to religious services. It was more of a cultural thing. Everyone went to church. I can still remember the days when we would go to church on Sunday mornings and we would turn the radio on so people would think someone was at home, right? Because people went away to church. And now who goes to church, right? We don't worry about those things as much anymore. So it's a different society we live in. But to Paul's point, it's a multi-faith society now too.
Yes.
And that needs to be reflected in the media also, and that's just something that we're trying to do, and something that you're trying to do through multi-faith is make sure those other religions are also recognized.
That's right, and I don't think you can quantify it with statistics, but I think from my own personal experience, there seems to be a resurgence of faith as I connect with individuals throughout the city and throughout the province. Faith is still important to many people. So even though those statistics are telling us that people of faith are dwindling, faith is still an important part of people's lives.
We'll just ask for a few more, but if there's time, we'll come back to you. Yeah.
I would just like to join your, the cup is more full than we think it is, group. Because my feeling as a lifelong member of the church is the people who are in church today are the people who want to be there. They're not there because of what will the neighbors think if they're not. they're not there because there's a war on, so God knows we have to sing, "Oh God, our help in ages past" every Sunday. It's the only hymn I know all the words to. We sang it from 1939 to 1945 every Sunday. But that sort of thing, when I go to church, I am surrounded by people I know and love, and they care about me and I care about them. And it makes my week. It's my refuel.
Yeah. If I can, there wasn't a question there, so let me just rephrase what I heard you saying, is that you can't
You're right, Michael,
measure
what I-
faith in our community by
numbers.
breadth, because another way of looking at faith in our community is by depth.
Yes.
And there's a lot of conviction, a lot of
Yes.
deep. Yeah, at the back, thanks. Yes, please.
But spirituality is, and to that point, as a former public school educator, in a society that's going to be kind of extremely diverse because of immigration, divorce, and COVID, what suggestions would you have if a public school system wanted to be as principled as possible, but still not deal with religion by simply avoiding it altogether? Let's see as they were being struck and saying, it's time we stop being all or nothing. What principles do you think should guide any exploration of faith and spirituality?
Just if I can repeat it for the online viewers, that as we become more diverse, greater diversity within and in the context of the public school system, what advice might you have for how we just not ignore it, but how we approach it in a principled way? Yeah, thank you.
My response would be, I'd like to write a column about that. Ask you what you think,
Yeah.
but what would others say?
Well,
Christine?
as a former educator, I did that very thing. I found that, religion it was taboo. And I found, I wouldn't say a way around it, but what I did was I focused on basic values and principles of faith. And so it was really social justice that I focused on with, and I was working with a grade 3 class. And a lot of people, I took them to the Siloam Mission, and we went and saw a play about a homeless child. And some people questioned that. They said, these children are 8 and 9 years old, and you're exposing them to such serious adult issues. I saw a class transform through that education. It wasn't in the curriculum. We had a kindness project, and they gathered food and gathered clothing and went to Siloam Mission and saw where it went and got a tour. And these children transformed. They were more caring, more community oriented. There's a lot of things that we can do in the educational program to increase that.
Here, here.
Right here.
I distinguish between religion, faith, and spirituality, and I'm wondering if you do as well, and how, because it seems to have been used a little bit interchangeably.
The question is, I distinguish between religion, faith, and spirituality, and I wonder if you do too, and how that affects your.
When I'm telling someone's story, it's their story, and how they come at it is how they come at it. If they come at it as a lifelong Anglican, like my friend Rennie here, then that's the story. But if they come at it as someone who doesn't go to church or any religious services, but has a sense of the mystical or the mysterious, I want to tell that story too. I also want to tell the stories of atheists and humanists, and I've even got a chapter there about the witches of Winnipeg, because they exist here too. And they are operating in a certain spiritual, mysterious kind of sphere, and they have a story to tell. So there are all sorts of stories that touch on mystery, divine, and I want to tell those stories.
Yeah, Bob?
John, I'm wondering if you can tell us how you came to writing about faith. I might note that, the continuing existence of faith coverage in Winnipeg is due almost entirely to John's stubbornness, because John has pushed every person involved in the media, pushed every publisher and editor of the Free Press since time immemorial, perhaps since Vatican II, To continue the faith coverage in the paper. John should take a lot of credit for keeping it going, but how did you come to it and how do you find the energy to keep it going?
The question is about how did John come to be someone who was interested in reporting on faith, being a journalist of faith?
I was working in communications for faith, church-related international relief and development organizations. So I quickly realized that the best way to reach other faith people was through the media, through the radio, television, newspapers, and I began to reach out and began to get to know people and began to take new publishers out for editors and publishers out for lunch, like you and others, and just to say, I introduced myself, and you really should be paying attention to this. It was Nick Hurst who asked me to be a Faith Page columnist, and a story that I haven't told anywhere else is in the late 1990s, when Nick was the editor, he wanted to end the Faith Page. He thought, nobody's reading it, nobody cares, he told me. And I said, well, what if I can show you that people care? He said, well, then we'll keep going. And so I got the word out. And remember, there's very little email and there's not hardly any websites. There's nothing like that back then. But I got the word out that the Free Press might end the Faith Page. So if you care about it, let Nick know. And about a month later, Nick called me and said, call him off. Because there were so many letters and so many phone calls of people saying this has to stay. And it's just grown from there. It's just recognizing that although newspaper readership is shrinking, it's still a very, very important way to reach a lot of people and people who care about their community. And I want to see this reflected back to them. And since Bob asked the question, I do want to give him credit along with Paul for being the folks who helped make the Religion in the News project possible. And we did our dog and pony show to 12 or 15 different faith groups back in 2018 to raise the money for this. And I want to thank you for it.
I am interested that editors and publishers get taken out for lunch because I don't think clergy do. We'll talk about that later, perhaps. Still have time for a couple more questions. Yeah, third row.
John, I'm wondering, you're not a prophet, you're a journalist, but based on your writing, your reporting, what do you see that you would call kind of the tip of the iceberg of tomorrow's issues?
What is the tip of the iceberg of tomorrow's issues in faith coverage?
I sometimes joke to people, if you want to chart the decline of organized religion in Canada, read my columns over 20 years. That's the big change I see.
That's not your fault. Is that what you're saying?
It's not causation.
It's not causation.
No.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
But that change is really significant. And the Anglicans were meeting in Ontario last week in a closed door board meeting to discuss what they're going to cut. They simply can't imagine how they will keep going. We have the challenges facing Holy Trinity and how they're going to save that building. Organizational religion is changing. I don't want to say it's disappearing. It's morphing, it's about to morph into something else. And I don't know what the else is. I do want to ask those questions and talk to people who have some ideas and thoughts about it. But that's, I think, the big thing that's happening to organized religion in this country. Something is happening, something's changing, and we in the media get a chance to chart it and observe it and report it back to you.
Is there a correlation between the decline in democracy and the decline?
Is there the question is there a correlation? Do you think there's a correlation between the decline in democracy and the decline of religious practice that we've been talking about?
Okay, I'm gonna try this one.
Yes or no?
If I chart Free Press readership and voter turnout, the lines go like this. Okay, so that's one marker of it. I worry, we talk about what has happened to faith and why are places of worship not perhaps as full as they once were. And I think the question maybe that needs to be considered or pondered is the extent to which we're worshiping at the market. And how much is the market dictating what we do? And it shapes things. And I think it shapes democracy in terms of what are the motivations. And I find it interesting. So, most of us, many of us, today I came straight from the office. So I work during the day. So there's the fruits of my labor, helping off, making sure the FB limited partnership share price doesn't fall below 55 cents. Then when we go home, there's this thing. So even in our leisure time, our activities are doing things that are helping Google, that are helping Facebook. I think what's interesting about any discussion of faith, it's an alternative force to the power of the market. And by and large, it is trying to come up with virtue. If we had a little more virtue, how much stronger would our society be? A little stronger virtue among our politicians. Could democracy be better? And then where would we be? I'm not saying we're at the promised land, but I think we would be closer to where we want to be, as opposed to some of the challenges that we are facing. You've seen in our streets, and not just in Winnipeg streets, it's happening everywhere. So the world has changed in many cases for the better, but there are things that are missing. And I think to a degree, faith has been part of it's part of our architecture. So you're an architect to a degree. I've seen him deliver a funeral service. It's wonderful. We don't have enough architects. We have too many arsonists.
Wow.
I'll just add something there
Can we
too.
ponder that last phrase for a bit? Yeah, okay. Too many arsonists, not enough architects. Thank you.
There you go. Call it another book.
There's a book.
Studies show that religious people of faith, vote more, they give more, they volunteer more, and interestingly enough, they read the media more, they participate in the media. And that's not because there's something divinely inspired about it, but if you go to a church service or any other kind of religious service, you are apt to be made aware of the needs of the world, of the needs of your community, in the prayers of the people, in a sermon, in your adult education class, if you still have those. You will become aware and more conscious of your community. There'll be something in your church bulletin saying, Salome needs more volunteers. Or to do something, right? And so you're consciously, at least once a week, if you go weekly, you're being made aware always, oh yeah, South Sudan or Sudan, there's 10 million people displaced, pray for them, give to whatever group your church supports so that we can help those people who have hunger and refugee needs. So that begins to tie in a little bit with what we call civil society, which is participating in our community, and religion is one of the ways that we can do that.
Churches have libraries.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you for all of those. I know we tend to be, we're all on the pro side, I think. Even Paul, editor of the Free Press, earlier used the metaphor of passing the collection plate. Now he's talking about the promised land. I think John's had a profound influence on Paul. Okay, one more question maybe from someone in the back we haven't heard from before. Yes, one. On the aisle, yeah, please.
John, having covered this heat since we heard it in 1965, could you share with us how covering this heat for so long has changed you?
How has covering this beat, religion, for so long changed you?
Well, it's broadened my perspectives in so many ways, and it's educated me. I hardly knew anything about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints before I started doing this, and now I have deep friendships in that church, and I know more and more about how they view the world and how they worship and the things that are important to them. The Muslim community, the Baha'i community, Sikh, Hindu, you name it. These are people and ideas I would not have really been able to get to know, except for this. And along the way, I've eaten some really, really good food.
There's the food again. Okay. All right, before we close, I just wanted to ask panelists to say one last thing about the Faith in the News project, or Religion in the News project. You've heard it referred to, and Paul explained it quite well early on. It did start with Bob Cox and John in 2018, or at least that's when the idea started to find some roots. The proceeds from the sale of the book will be going to the Religion in the News project, unless it's a massive international bestseller, in which case John may change his mind. If it makes $7 million, it may end up at Holy Trinity, perhaps, if we see so inclined. But maybe just remind us, because that's a motivating factor in the publishing of the book. What was going on 6 years ago? How did it take shape? What's that story?
Well, that story is about Bob and Paul. And Paul announcing one day in the Free Press that the Free Press wants to do a better job of engaging all the communities in Winnipeg. And so I asked for a meeting with Bob and Paul, and I told them, if you want to engage all the communities, one community you're not doing a very good job of engaging is the faith community. And Bob and Paul said, well, if we had more money, we would do it. And I said, what if I go out and raise it? And that's how the project came to be. And Michael and Charleswood Church, United Church, deserves a lot of credit, because you were the first ones in. You're the ones who said, yeah, we'll do it. And once they were in, well, everybody else had to be like Charleswood, right? So, and join in. And today there are about 25 different groups and organizations and faith groups that donate every year to make the project possible, together with individuals, because you all can participate too through the crowdfunder, and there's a link on faith articles on the website. Anything from the editor's desk?
We make those articles, we do have a paywall, part of our business model. The faith stories are in front of that, so it's free to everyone to access. It's interesting, when we rolled out the project initially and I told readers what we were doing, there was some pushback. They thought, aha, now you're gonna dictate what has happened. And I did my best to assure them that it hasn't. And I think the test of time has proven that it hasn't done. And who the doubting Thomases at the beginning, I'm not sure we converted them, but they are at least not casting any stones around. My Sunday teacher is real happy.
Christine, get us out of here. What does faith in the news, religion in the news meant from the perspective of faith communities?
Well, I'm not gonna speak for all faith communities, but this project has meant the world to me. It means a lot to me, and I'm probably one of the best cheerleaders, but I also did face those cynics in my own community, and anyone I spoke to about it, they thought, oh, we're paying for faith coverage. How is that gonna work? That's not gonna be very transparent. And so, but what John has done is amazing. It's really working to accomplish the goals that we're trying to accomplish through interfaith dialogue and greater understanding of people of faith and people of no faith. And so I just wanted to thank John for all the efforts that he's made in this regard. I'm appreciative of it. I also think that because of what John's done, we've been able to make some, I think, better connections. And so I just appreciate that, and I thank him.
That's a great place to end. Thank you, John. Thank you, panelists. Thank all of you. The last word was about where to find John, the books, and the signing. Oh, there you are. Oh, yes. Maybe we'll have another night. And I have and really, for a robot, is loving God a necessity for salvation, or is that part of God's agency? Discuss.
Yeah. Oh.
And on that note, huge thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you for sharing. Thank you all for your attention and for your very thoughtful questions throughout the evening. It's been a real pleasure spending the night with all of you tonight. As mentioned previously, we will now safely transport John Longhurst to a table which is just beside our cash desk. There's a pile of books there. There's a pile of books at our cash desk. I will summon you over as soon as he is safely situated, and then you can get in line to get your books signed. You don't need to pay for them first, but we do ask that you pay for them at some point this evening before you leave. I will point out that it is raining, so you'll want to stock up on books. Take the opportunity to actually pile up as many books as you possibly can, as you have plenty of time to just chat with John and get your books signed. We're so very grateful to CMU Press for all that they do in publishing. Locally, we celebrated some more of their books just the other week. It's a pleasure to celebrate this latest here tonight. I'd ask you all to join me one more time in acknowledging this incredible panel and, of course, John Longhurst.